Okay, folks, we'll go ahead and get started. Please take your seats. Before we start, I want to do a shout out for our ASL interpreters over here who do a wonderful job every year. Okay, we're back and running here. So I just want to briefly introduce you to Sidney Trent. She's the social issues editor over at the Washington Post. The Washington Post has been a good friend of this book festival, I think right from the start. And I'll tell you, I live in North Carolina. That's a paper I pay a subscription to. That's my paper. So anyway, Sidney, welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Sidney Trent, and I'm social issues editor at the Washington Post, which is a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival. First, a word of thanks to the co-chairman of the festival, David Rubenstein, and the other generous sponsors who've made this event possible. If you'd like to add your financial support, please note the information in your program. We'll have some time after this presentation for your questions, and I've been asked to remind you that if you come to the microphone, you will be included in the videotape of this event, which may be broadcast at a later date. I was particularly excited to be asked to introduce this author, Tayari Jones. I read her book, An American Marriage, recently as part of my book club, and was struck by what an inspired idea it was to focus on the emotional impact of Black male incarceration in a work of fiction. We are all familiar with this as a topic in the news, but Jones's perceptive and compassionate narrative voice reveals the full dimensions of the damage that unjust incarceration has on African American couples, their families, and the human spirit. Jones is the author of novels Leaving Atlanta, The Untelling, Silver Sparrow, and An American Marriage. Her writing has appeared in Tin House, The Believer, The New York Times, and Callaloo. A member of the Fellowship of Southern Writers, she has also been a recipient of the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, Lifetime Achievement Award in Fine Arts from the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, the United States Artist Fellowship, NEA Fellowship, and Radcliffe Institute Bunting Fellowship. Silver Sparrow was added to the NEA Big Read Library of Classics in 2016. Jones is a graduate of Spelman College, University of Iowa, and Arizona State University. She is a professor of creative writing at Emory University. And now I introduce Tayari Jones.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction and for the invitation to be here today. And thank you to all of you for believing in literature and books. This is a holiday weekend. Y'all could be doing other things. So on behalf of everyone who's ever written a book, everyone who's ever wanted to read a book, who's ever wanted to write a book, thank you for choosing to spend your weekend this way. It means so much because when you write a novel, in some ways you feel like you're sending a letter in a bottle. You spend all this time writing on it and you throw it out there and you don't know if it'll ever reach anyone. And so for all of you to show up today, not just for this session, but for all the sessions, I just want to thank you on behalf of all of us. I came to the National Book Festival for the first time 7 years ago with my last book, and when I was there as a guest of the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, and I want to just take a moment to tell you all how much these national programs mean to writers who are just starting out. The NEA nurtures talent. Back when, when I wrote my first 3 books, basically nobody read them but my mother and the NEA. And I was given a grant which allowed me to take some time off and work on my book. And then when the book was out, the NEA selected me to come to the National Book Festival. And that was the first time I had ever spoken to a room with more than, say, 50 people in it. And it meant a lot to me as a writer and also as an American citizen to be supported like that as an artist by the government. And the NEA, as you know, is in a position now where it's fighting for its life. So should you ever find yourself in the company of your congressperson or anybody with any clout, or even anybody without clout, tell them how much the NEA means to all of us. When we were invited here, they said, you talk about your book and talk about yourself. And I was thinking, should I talk about my books or should I talk about myself? But I realized on some level, they're the same thing. And like I said, I was here 7 years ago. And when I was here 7 years ago, the world was very different than it is now. And my life was different. So I was thinking, well, who am I now versus 7 years ago? When I came here 7 years ago, my message really was to tell everyone out there who has a dream, who has a passion, to follow it, that if you do your part to follow your dreams and your passion, then the universe, God, however you do it, will meet you halfway. Because my life has been full of stories of times when it looked like I would not be a writer. There were times it looked like I wouldn't continue to be a writer, but I gave it my all. I started writing when I was a kid. I was like 16 years old, and I knew that I liked to write. I had little notebooks and everything. But when I was a teenager, if you were a girl and you liked to read and you liked to write, people didn't think it meant you were a writer or an intellectual. People thought it meant you were nice. Because when I was coming up, when you're a girl, you were either a nice girl or a not nice girl. And that was the only question. And if you liked to read all the time, then you were nice. I used to say, because no one ever got pregnant in the library. But librarians always raise their hand and say, that's not true. So I'll say that few people get pregnant in the library. But when I went to college, I went to Spelman College, which is a women's college in Atlanta, and it was there that I met a writer, and she was my teacher. Her name was Pearl Clegg, and I took her class. Freshmen were not allowed to take this class, but I had never met a writer before, and I wanted to be in the class, and I thought it over, and things were not computerized in the late 80s, so there was a lot more wiggle room in creating your own narrative, shall we say. And you had to get your advisor to sign to give you permission to take a class that was above your level. And I figured my advisor had a lot of advisees. She wouldn't remember me. So what if I just kind of were to sign her name a little bit to get into this class? So I did this, and I signed up, and I got into this class. And the advisor called me in, and she said, this is not my signature. And I was like, yes, ma'am, I'm sorry. But she said to me that if a kid wants to take a class, like if the kid is doing basically fraud, but in order to take a class, let her take that class. So I promised to never commit fraud again. And to this day, I have not, but I took the class, and the teacher, Pearl Clegg, said to me, what are you thinking about? And I got ready to tell her what I was thinking about, and she says, no, don't tell me. Write it down. And in that, she became my first audience. And so I worked hard because I wanted to write down what I was thinking, and I wanted to follow the example she set for me, and I wanted to be a writer. But I didn't know how to go from being a college student to being a writer. When I finished school, I didn't even know there was a such thing as a graduate program in creative writing. I thought writers just were. And I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. And everyone was pushing me to do a PhD in literature. Everyone said, oh, you can be a professor. You can write on the weekends, right? Don't worry about it. And I didn't want to do it because I felt like I was a bird, and they wanted me to become a bird watcher. But I was also very young, so I went to do this PhD, and I didn't like it. I felt like I was my face pressed to the glass of what I really wanted to do. And so I wrote to Pearl and told her, I'm so unhappy, I don't want to be here. And she said to me, well, just quit. And I was like, I can't quit. I was raised like probably many of you, you have to finish what you start. And I felt that being there, I was representing myself, I was representing my family, I was representing my college. I felt like I was representing Black people everywhere, and that if I were to leave, then anyone who had anything in common with me would never have the opportunity to go to school to get a PhD there. But Pearl said, that's not how it works. I was like, really? She's like, no, people quit things all the time. I said, are you sure? She said, oh yeah. So I just wrote the people a letter. I didn't say I quit. I said a lot of things, thank you for this opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. Then I said, I quit. And I started trying to write a novel. I wanted to write a novel about my experiences growing up in Atlanta during the Atlanta child murders. When I was a kid, 28 Black children were murdered in Atlanta, and 2 of them were children in my elementary school. I wanted to write a novel not about the murders. I didn't want to turn my childhood into an episode of Law and Order or true crime or a thriller. I wanted to write what it was like to be a child in the early 80s, and this was happening. Because someone said to me, oh, you must not have had a childhood. And my feeling was, we did have a childhood. Our childhood intersected with this tragedy, but our lives were not a tragedy. And that became my mission in writing this book. And so I didn't know how to go about it. I started it, and this is what I'm saying about when you dedicate yourself to something with all your heart. I literally ran into a writer who directed a creative writing program. And she's here, she's at a different stage. I think we're speaking simultaneously, but her name is Jewel Parker Rhodes, and I met her, and she said, come to Arizona and work with me. She said, I'll help you, I'll be your mentor. And I said, oh no, ma'am, I can't move to Arizona. I said, it's hot out there. And this was in the early 90s. Do you remember when they didn't have the King holiday out there? And I said, oh, and they don't have the King holiday. And she said, it's only hot in the summertime, and there has been a voter referendum, and I will have you a King holiday by the time you get there. So I felt like it was my own personal King holiday. So I was in my 20s, I told my parents, I'm moving to Arizona. They were like, you can't move to Arizona. You don't know anyone out there. It's hot out there. And besides, they don't have the King holiday. And I said, actually, there's been a voter referendum. And so I went out there and I wrote my first book, and I felt really good I felt that I was doing my life's work. I didn't sell very many copies, I didn't earn out my advance, no one had ever heard of me that wasn't related to me, but I felt like I was doing what I was meant to do. But life is full of challenges. When I wrote my 3rd book, I turned it in, and they had computers. Remember I said there weren't computers in the beginning? There are computers now. And the computers there's a computer program. Those of you who are in the business will know it, but it's called BookScan. BookScan means they can put your name in a computer and see exactly how many books you've sold. You used to could fake it. You could act successful, and people would think you were successful. But now there's this computer program that says, don't believe the hype. And it gives an exact number of how many books you've sold. So for my 3rd book, I couldn't get a contract because of my BookScan. And I felt really defeated by this computer program. It was so exact and so declarative, not profitable. So I didn't want to continue writing the book, but the book was important to me. It was a book I had written about my relationship with my sister. I have a sister, we weren't raised together, we lived completely different lives. But all my life, I felt like I both had a sister and didn't have a sister. Like I had a sister who was right there in my peripheral vision, but when I turned my head, there was no one there. And I wanted to write this novel for everyone who has siblings that you didn't grow up with, but you feel connected with them, but you don't know how to bridge the gap. So I knew I had to finish writing this book, even though I had been all but promised that I would never have a publisher for it because of this BookScan. Well, I wrote the book, I started writing it, and then I got a mysterious phone call, and the area code was from LA. I have one friend in LA, he's very successful, and when things don't go 100% right for him, he calls me to complain. At this point in my life, things were going 98% wrong for me, and I did not want to hear him talk about his slight disappointment. But I thought, okay, that's not being a good friend, so I answered the phone. And the person on the phone said they were calling me from an arts organization called the United States Artists Foundation. I thought they were telemarketing me. And I felt like this was not a good time for me to be asked to give money to other people because I have no money. And they said, no, 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 we are calling to support you as a writer. We'd like to give you some money to spend a year to work on your book. And being honest, I said, well, I told them about the book scan. I said, I don't think I'll be able to publish this book. And they said, we don't care about book scan. We don't care about numbers. We care about art and artists and stories. So I took that year off. I finished the book. And I put the book in a drawer because I just didn't know how I could publish it. But I knew I had done my part. I feel like when you're given a gift, all God asks of you is that you use that gift. The rest, that's his job. For me, just finish the book. So I finished the book and I put it in a drawer. I had one activity left on my schedule as a writer, and I had been invited to a literary seminar to give a reading. And I didn't want to go, but I had already said yes. And, again, all this, I felt like I was representing everybody, and if I didn't go, ruin it, that same story. I feel like that that idea of thinking is probably gonna follow me the rest of my life, this feeling of letting down the entire race if you don't show up. So I went to the thing in Florida, but the day, like a week before, the Florida people called me and said, we can't get your existing books because your books are out of print. Now, when your books are out of print, that means they're not printing them anymore, like it never happened. And I was like, that's impossible. But no, it was possible because of the what? Book scan. So, but I went to Florida and I was embarrassed because I felt that I would give a reading and I wouldn't have any books to sign, and people would say, where are your books? And I would have to say, my books are out of print. Because of book scan, I can't get a book contract. But I went anyway, and when I got there, the bookseller had 4 copies of my books. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I said, well, where did you get those? And they said, oh, they came in this box. And they showed me the box, and I recognized my father's very distinct handwriting. And I called him, I said, Daddy, he said, yeah, I sent my books. He said, and I went to your uncle's house and I got his books. He said, those books were unread. They're brand new. Your uncle hadn't even looked at them. And Daddy said, so this is what you'll do. You sign those 4 books, and when anyone else comes up to your signing table, you just tell them you sold out. So I read from my work in progress, and I sat down at the signing table, I signed the 4 books, and then a woman came up to me and she wanted a book signed, and I said, oh, I'm so sorry, I sold out. And she said, oh, that's good, because I heard that, you're having a hard time with your book scan, and I heard that your books are out of print, and I was dying because I had gone through all this trouble to pretend like this wasn't happening. But the woman said, I think I can help you. Now, if you're a writer, there are all kinds of people who think they can help you. They have all kinds of crazy schemes. Their uncle might have a printing press in the basement. You just don't know. But she said, I can help you. And she took me by the hand, and she carried me through the crowd. And she literally put my hand in the hand of another woman whom I recognized as a publisher. And I recognized her because they had already rejected my book because of what? Book scan. I hate book scans so much. But anyway. And the woman asked me, she said, well, what's your book about? I said, oh, it's about 2 girls. They have the same father, but only one of them knows. And she said, that's interesting. You should send it to me. But I was embarrassed because I knew that the company had already rejected me. And I was trying to get away. But that lady, she had my hand like this. And finally, as I got away, she said, but wait, before you go, she said, how do you know Judy? And I said, oh, I don't know anyone named Judy. And she says, no, 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 Judy Bloom, who just introduced us. It was as though my nerdy childhood had come to rescue me in my time of need. And I looked to tell her thank you, and she had vanished like a real fairy godmother. And y'all, within a week, my career was back on track. That book, it happened. I love to say it's a true story. And that book was called Silver Sparrow. My publishing career was back. I had a publisher things were back, and that's the book that got me to the festival the last time I was here. And I felt really good about it, but again, this life as an artist, it keeps challenging you to grow and do something different. So when it came time to write my fourth novel, I had a publisher. I didn't have to worry about that. My book scan was fine. Thank you very much. But I wanted to write a novel about something bigger than my own life. I wanted to write something about something meaningful. Like all of you, I noticed that the world seems to be on fire. And I felt that as a writer, part of my job is, all of our job is to try to put out the flames with whatever we have. And what I have is my pen. And so I wanted to write a novel. I wanted to do something about wrongful incarceration. And so I wrote a grant, and I was accepted to Harvard University to do research on the topic. And I did all this research. I discovered terrible things. Like, did you know that at any given moment, over 2.5 million people are in prison? Over 4 million people are on parole or on probation. Here in Washington, D.C., 1 out of 4 Black men will at some time be in jail or in prison. 1 out of 28 American children have a parent who's in prison. Every time anyone is in prison, it represents a kind of family separation, because we are all members of a family. And I wanted to write something about this, but I had these statistics, but I didn't have a story. A problem is not a story. A situation is not a story. And I didn't know what to do. So here I am at Harvard. They want us to give a presentation on our work. And all I have to show for my time there is a very underlined, battered copy of The New Jim Crow, a whole stack of angry index cards, but no story. And I didn't know what to do. I went home to Atlanta, where I'm from, to spend some time with my mother, which I do when I'm upset. And while I was there, I spent some time at the mall, which I do when I'm upset. And when I was at the mall, I heard a couple arguing. The woman was fantastically dressed. She looked just gorgeous. And the guy she was with, he looked fine. He looked okay, but she looked great. And I could tell that they were in love and in trouble. And I heard her say, clear as a bell, she said, "Roy, you know you wouldn't have waited on me for 7 years." And I was interested. I didn't know him, I didn't know her, but I was looking and I felt like, "You right, girl, he probably would not have waited on you for 7 years." And he looked at her and he said, "I don't know what you're talking about, because this wouldn't have happened to you in the first place." And I looked at her and I thought, "You right, this probably wouldn't have happened to her." And for me, I know I have a novel when I'm writing from a place where both people are telling the truth, both people are right, and both people are wrong. Because when I do that, I have a moral quandary. So An American Marriage is the story of a young couple who are only married 18 months when the husband is arrested for a crime he does not commit. As she says, "I don't know if I was yet a wife or if I was still a bride." You know, she says, "I was still combing the rice out of my hair." Her daddy's still paying for the wedding when he is arrested and given a lengthy sentence. And so then the question is this: what is loyalty? How do we take care of one another in times of crisis? The question of what is selfish? Is it more selfish if she wants to live her own life, or is it more selfish for him not to want her to live her own life? How do we make compromises? And so I started writing this novel. When I first started writing it, I wrote it all from the point of view of the wife, Celestial, because I'm a Southern writer, and Southern novels are all about women who don't do what they're told. And I wrote it, but it didn't feel like the whole truth. So then I wrote the whole novel a second time, all from his point of view, the man who's been stripped of everything he worked for and put into prison and has to figure out how to find his way back. And when I wrote that, it was easy, but it didn't feel right, because I realized it was a story I had heard so many times before. I realized that it essentially was the same story as the Odyssey that I read in high school, right? Like Odysseus, he just is facing all these trials, and he just wants to come home to a faithful woman and a clean house. And that was written in 70 BC, right? So I was like, what is the update of that story? And then I decided I heard Claudia Rankine read from a poem from her collection, Citizen, and I used it as the epigraph of this book, and it says, "What happens to you doesn't belong to you, only half concerns you. It's not yours only." And I realized that this story was not his story or her story, it was their story, and I toggled their points of view, but it still didn't feel complete. Because I don't think it's a spoiler to say this, but An American Marriage is a story about justice, it's a love story, and it's also a love triangle. And so I added the voice of another man, and when I had all three of their voices, I felt like I had the whole story of what happens when people are forced to make decisions they shouldn't have to make in the first place. I thought I would end my talk by reading to you just a couple pages from the first chapter, and then I thought we could take some questions. I have to put on my glasses because lately, like when I turned 40, all the words in books became so small. Write to your congressman about that. This is from the point of view of Celestial on the day of Roy's trial. What I know is this: they didn't believe me. 12 people and not one of them took me at my word. There in the front of the room, I explained that Roy couldn't have raped the woman in room 206 because we had been together. I told them about the magic fingers that wouldn't work, about the movie that played on the snowy television. The prosecutor asked me what we had been fighting about. Rattled, I looked to Roy and to both our mothers. Banks objected, so I didn't have to answer, but the pause made it appear that I was concealing something rotten at the pit of our very young marriage. Even before I stepped down from the witness stand, I knew that I had failed him. Maybe I wasn't appealing enough, not dramatic enough, not from around here. Who knows? Uncle Banks, coaching me, had said, "Now is not the time to be articulate. Now is the time to give it up. No filter, all heart. No matter what you're asked, what you want the jury to see is why you married him." I tried, but I didn't know how to be anything other than well-spoken in front of strangers. I wish I could have brought a selection of my artwork, all images of Roy. I would then say, "This is who he is to me. Isn't he beautiful? Isn't he gentle?" But all I had were words which are light and flimsy as air. As I took my seat, not even the black lady juror would look at me. It turns out that I watched too much television. I was expecting a scientist to come and testify about DNA. I was waiting for a pair of handsome detectives to burst into the courtroom at the last minute, whispering something urgent. Everyone would see that this was a big mistake, a major misunderstanding. We would all be shaken but appeased. I fully believed that I would leave the courtroom with my husband beside me. Secure in our home, we would tell people how no black man is really safe in America. But 12 years is what they gave him. We would be 43 years old when he was released. Roy understood that 12 years was an eternity because he sobbed right there at the defendant's table. His knees gave way and he fell into his chair. The judge paused and demanded that Roy bear this news on his feet. He stood again and cried, not like a baby, but in a way that only a grown man can cry, from the bottom of his feet up through his torso and finally through his mouth. When a man wails like that, you know it's all the tears he was never allowed to shed. As Roy howled, my fingers kept worrying a rough patch of skin beneath my chin, a souvenir of scar tissue. When they did what I remember as kicking in the door, what everyone else remembers as opening it with a key, after the door was open, however it was open, we were both pulled from the bed. They dragged Roy into the parking lot and I followed, lunging for him, wearing nothing but a white slip. Someone pushed me to the ground and my chin hit the pavement. My slip rode up, showing everything to everyone, and my tooth sank into the soft skin of my bottom lip. Roy was on the asphalt beside me, barely beyond my grasp, speaking words that didn't reach my ears. I don't know how long we lay there, parallel like burial plots. Husband, wife, what God has brought together, let no man tear asunder. Thank you. now I'm happy to take your questions. Don't be shy, I'm nice. Come on up.
Hi.
Hi.
I really loved the book you had about your sister, and then I was wondering, just having written a lot very personal stories to you, how do you feel about Celestial and all the world you create in American Marriage? Are they kind of your family now, in a sense, or what's it like to come up with characters that aren't going to be your own life?
You know, when I was writing this, at first when I started writing, I felt like, oh, it's so far away from my life. You know, Celestial's husband is arrested for a crime he doesn't commit. You know, I don't have a husband at all, let alone one that's been arrested for a crime he didn't commit. But what I realized is that the thing that made this story moving for me to write is the extent to which her problems were the same as their problems as a couple are the same as all couples. It's just that it's turned up so much higher for them. Like, the question at the heart of her predicament is, how much of yourself do you devote to your relationship, and how much do you hold back for your own dreams? I mean, that's her question. It's just so much more intense. And that also made it heartbreaking because it really added a deeper human dimension to the issue when I think about questions of mass incarceration, that they are just like us because they are just like us. And the deprivation of their rights is just as same as the deprivation of yours or mine. Thank you.
I want to thank you for the gift of your books
Oh, thank you.
and ask you whether you might share with us what you're working on now.
The question is, what is working on me? I'm trying to work on a new novel. I'm not sure the angle. See, my feeling is like, if you have a real life experience that makes you think there's a novel there, you don't quite know the angle yet, but I will tell you this thing that happened to me when I was a little girl that I've been wondering about ever since. When I was 12 years old, I went to a wedding, and we were sitting out there in the pews, all dressed up, and the bride didn't come down the aisle for 2 hours. And so we went in the back, me and my mom, and there was the bride. She looked so pretty, but she was crying. She did not want to marry him. And she was, her mother, everyone was there, the reception, everything was set. And one of her bridesmaids said, I have an idea. How about you go through with the ceremony, walk down the aisle, just don't file the papers. That way, no one's embarrassed, you don't have to actually be married, and you get to keep the toaster. And I have always wondered two things. Why didn't she want to marry him? And at what point did she tell him she wasn't filing the papers? You see? So I think that that's at the center of a story. There's something in there that I want to tease out, like what, but I don't know what, but I'm in there somewhere.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Hello.
First I want to say I love your book, and I've never had the experience of having a parent be incarcerated, but I can definitely relate to the emotion of sort of the separation and this idea of, sort of being in a quandary of, like, do you follow this relationship or do you follow your own dreams, like you were saying. But I also wanted to ask, looking at you, kind of Celestial reminds me of actually you from an aesthetic perspective. And I was just wondering, are there people in your life that you model the characters personality-wise after, or like how do you develop the characters as people when you're writing?
Well, you're right. She does look like me, doesn't she? Well, also, I have been this tall since I was about 13 years old. So I do try. And when I was a kid and being this tall, I never read about a woman or a girl that people desired that were this tall. So I did kind of do that as just a gesture of love to my teenage self. But I think we all have things that we wish we could go in a time machine and give ourselves, a hug, or just a little heads up from the future to say, it's going to be fine, just hang in there. But with the other characters, I do sort of, I have a friend who swears up and down that I steal all of his best lines and put them in my books. I'm like, I don't steal them, you still have them. You know, but I do try to capture the way I think people really talk. Because I think that something that we can do in fiction that our peers in, like if I was writing a nonfiction book about wrongful incarceration, I wouldn't be able to capture the things about the culture that will never be in like a scholarly text. The funny things people say, what people do, little love notes to people in my life to let them know that I am watching them and seeing them. But I try not to stick too closely to one person, because if I model a character off of a person, then I start to feel like if I let the character do something else, the real life person will feel like I'm lying on them or judging them. So I try, whenever it feels too close, I move in another direction.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I would just like to say thank you. You've graced me with your presence today. I'm more than inspired because I'm writing my first novel, and the title is His Double Life. It's a story about a small town hero who lets everyone down in a love triangle that he gets. So when you mentioned the love triangle, I was like, oh yeah, I'm doing something like that. So what would be your advice for me getting started with the project? I mean, I've started it, but what can you give me so that I have a good book scan once it's...
I can't, I honestly can't help you with the book scan, and also I almost hate that I told you about the book scan.
I'm glad that you did, because I won't, be discouraged in case.
But I feel like the writing business and the writing are two different things. And I really encourage people who are just starting out not to find out anything about the business, because no one has ever come from a lecture about the business and felt like, oh, I feel inspired to write now. You always feel discouraged by the business. So the one thing I would say, yeah, find out as little as possible about how it works until you have your book done. Because I want you to write a book that speaks to your heart and find an editor or an agent that can sell what you've written. I don't want you trying to write what they will sell. You see, I want it to be all about your unique vision. If I had known when I wrote my first book, in my first book about growing up in Atlanta during the child murders, all the characters are like 8 years old, and half of the book is written in the second person. If I had known anything about the business, I never would have written such a quirky, eccentric novel, because someone would have said, that will never sell.
True.
But part of the benefit of my early writing was that no one was paying any attention to me. I never worried what anyone would think. I never thought anyone would think anything. So I didn't have to be bold enough to put the voices out of my head, because I felt like in many ways I was just an invisible person doing something for my own spirit. But if I had to give you a concrete piece of advice, is this. You know how people are always saying writers write every day, you have to write every day? That is a myth. You do not have to write every day. I feel that we tell people that because we want you to be consistent, but I think that what it accidentally does is that it sets a bar where people who have busy lives, people who work, people who have children, people who are doing elder care, they feel they can't be writers because they don't have enough leisure time. And if we end up with a canon of American literature that's written only by people with leisure time, I feel like the most important stories would be left out. The reason why most of us can't write every day, we can't write every day because we're doing important work, and that's what needs to be written about. So I say, see if you can write 3 times a week. I feel, this is how I do it. You know how they tell you, you go to the gym 3 times a week? When the rest of y'all are at the gym, that's when I work on my books.
Thank you very much.
Hi. Thank you so much for writing a book that captured the human complexity of emotions, and nothing is black or white. And if I ever get married, I'm going to adopt the safe word during an escalated fight. I really like that. But my question is, in an alternate world, if Roy did not go to jail, do you think Celestial and Roy would have made it anyways?
Maybe. I mean, I feel that you never know with any relationship if it's going to work, right? And also, what does work mean? I mean, because you can look at a relationship that's lasted 50 years, but all that says is that it has stood the test of time, but that doesn't say anything about the quality of that relationship, right? I mean, sometimes relationships end because they are healthy. sometimes relationships endure because they are not healthy. So I don't think the question is whether or not they would have made it. The question is whether or not they would have grown from the experience. And I think that they would have. But I think it would have been challenging. I think that relationships are challenging. But this is what I also think. Celestial and Roy are in a situation they never should have been in. And you know how, and I think this is part of the racial aspect of it. You know how, like, if you're a black person and people, when you're growing up, people tell you, you have to work twice as hard to get half as much. You have to be the best, always have to be the best. I feel like in the context of their relationship with him being wrongfully incarcerated, for them to have made it, I mean, they would have had to have been twice as good, 3 times as good as other couples to maintain their marriage. Like, what does it mean if that, with that idiom of you have to be so good to even follow you into your personal life? I feel like that is one of the many injustices visited upon this couple.
Thank you.
Hi, I wish I was as tall as you. I'm very fortunate. I've been able to go to Book Expo a number of times, and the place I spend most of my time is at Algonquin Books, because I believe that the books that are published by Algonquin speak to all aspects of the life we should all be learning about. So they showed me your book before it came out and said, you must read this book. And I wanted to ask you how important it is that your publisher have a vision of where your work fits into the world around you. How important that is to making you a better writer and you a confident and successful writer.
I do think, I love my publisher. I'm published by Algonquin Books of Chapel Hill. I believe in independent publishing. They're an independent publisher, and they have a small list.
Yes.
And every book they publish is a book they love. They don't publish books they don't plan to put forward. It makes a big difference to have an editor that listens to the writer. I mean, my editor understood. I was really worried with this book that people would think that because it has that it was a novel about prison, right? That it would be filed almost like sociology, almost like this was like the new Jim Crow, the musical. I was really afraid that that's how it would be. But my editor, he read it and he said, this is a love story. And I knew that he understood what I was doing, because I think that when you reduce people to their problems, I was told when I was training as a writer, they said you should write about people and their problems, not problems and their people. And I was really pleased to have an editor who understood this is about people and their problems. And it does make all the difference in the world, how it's packaged, how they want it to look, how they talk about it to other people. But the most important thing about being with an independent publisher, this book was 4 years overdue. It was 4 years late. And they wanted the book, but they didn't pressure me, and they didn't try to get me to give them whatever they had so they could rush it to market. Do you remember that? Remember those commercials? I think only people of a certain age. Remember that commercial when the guy would say, "We sell no wine before it's time." Remember that? That's how they are with books. They felt like the book isn't ready. It's like a cake. You got to let the cake stay in the oven as long as it needs to. They're never going to publish a cake that's still wet in the middle, and I feel they did that for me in this book, and I will always be grateful for the gift of time.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for one more question.
Thank you for your book. My question actually dovetails with your last answer. You mentioned the new Jim Crow twice.
You can wait. I'll do one more. We'll do more. Okay.
Do you have, you mentioned the new Jim Crow twice. Do you have other books that were particularly impactful or that you recommend, either fiction or nonfiction, that include like a humane or a real personal or lived experience of incarceration?
You know, the thing that was most helpful to me, there's a book from McSweeney's called Surviving Justice, and it is oral histories of people who've been wrongfully incarcerated. And the thing about it that surprised me is that the people who were wrongfully incarcerated were more interested in the reality of incarceration for everyone. Like, they didn't hold themselves up as, I'm innocent, therefore this shouldn't happen to me. They were more interested in the way that prison affects everyone. Like, they didn't make a line between wrongfully and implying that there is therefore a rightfully person that's incarcerated. And that would be the book that I recommend most. But there's also Upstate by Kalisha Buchanan. It's really good. It's a YA novel. It's all letters between a young people and the boyfriend that's incarcerated. There's a lot. I'm really excited. But then there's The Middle of Nowhere, the feature film by Ava DuVernay. I was really encouraged by how many people are talking about this issue in different ways, so I never had to fear that I wasn't writing the definitive story.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for writing this book. Our book club just recently discussed it a couple days ago, and it was probably one of the most heartfelt, impactful conversations we've had in a long time. We're a group of all white women with one Latina. So I think we grabbed a lot. It grabbed us deep down. And one of the book club questions that are out there is, how did you envision Roy's accuser?
I knew we were going to get there. I was thinking maybe we weren't going to get there, but we're here.
That was the one that I asked, and everyone in the room, envisioned her white. And I did not. I did not, because I'm thinking they're in a motel in the South, and I really didn't believe a white woman would have talked to him at that ice machine and then invited him back to the room to help whatever, can't even think of it, what the issue was he was helping her with. And that really led to a really deep, soul-searching conversation amongst us. So how did you envision her?
This thing, I don't identify the race of the woman who accused Roy. And I didn't identify her for a couple reasons. One is that I felt like we could get derailed from the rest of the story. Sure. It was so tricky with him being a black man falsely accused of rape that in reading the book, I didn't want to relitigate so much of American history and not be able to get forward to the rest of the story, which was about their marriage. So I thought that I could just slide by that. And also, there's this Toni Morrison short story called Recitative about two girls who are in foster care, and they're having all these racial conflicts throughout their lives. And she never tells you which one of them is black and which one is white. And I teach, and if you teach, your students will almost come to blows over which one they think is black and white. And so I thought I would do a little wink to Morrison, because I feel like every book I've written, I wink at her in some way, because I hope one day she will notice me. And so I don't really go into it, but when it's going to cause me a problem? I'm going to have to step up to that, because we're making a movie. And they have to cast somebody. I was like, can't we just put her in shadow? They're like, no. So I'm going to say the answer to that question will be coming to a theater near you. Thank you very much.